and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
With me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, business, and do you know what? Sometimes the world tick. Today is part 2 of our influencers. I think it's safe to say that we over-optimistically thought we could talk about Joseph Stalin in under an hour, and we realized the foolishness of this because actually, if I remember rightly, Gareth, we got to just before the Second World War, so we haven't even got onto some really, really interesting stuff about the influence. And just before we start, I know we often sort of pull back the curtain and let you know we're recording this just after Donald Trump has announced a very wide-ranging set of, frankly, global tariffs, including tariffs against some poor penguins in an Australian dependency. A different conversation, a different time. But the reason why I bring that up is I can't help but thinking, for many of our influencers, let's pick Dolly Parton. She weaves into our world, and it doesn't feel like the world trembles when she does something. Nevertheless, she's an influencer. And yet there are a small number of these influencers where their decisions make the world spin differently on its axis. And I've mentioned the tariffs. We're a few days into them, and I look around and I see people looking blindsided and gobsmacked that no one could have imagined that these things might happen. And now if we fast forward to Joseph Stalin in terms of the impact of him as an influencer, right? Actually, maybe we need to come up with a different term because influencer is quite nice. And I think we've already decided that Joseph Stalin, probably not very nice. Maybe dictator. Do we have to come up with a third series called Dictators? I don't know. But it really feels like if we wanted to know what it felt like when Joseph Stalin was in charge, if you were a Russian, I think we've just had a little bit of that echo in our own current world, in that the tariffs could quite feasibly change the world order. I might sound overly excitable about this, and we can't tell, but I sit here thinking the idea that the United States has entered a surprise, for want of a better word, global trade war, that is surprising and scary, and I don't know the outcome. Joseph Stalin, as the leader of Russia, who I think it's fair to say at the end of the last episode had just, I don't think he did this himself, but he potentially paid someone to stick an ice pick in his pal Trotsky's head. And now we are going to start facing to the Second World War. Maybe that's how it felt. This is a man who started to shape the global world order, and we still feel the resonance of that today. So where did we finish, Gareth?
I was listening to you there and just thinking, we talked yesterday when we recorded the previous week's episode about the fact that Stalinism as an ideology or as a political doctrine is separated from communism or Marxism. And of course, the two are very closely related. But I said that there are still elements of Stalinism that are alive today. And I explicitly referenced Vladimir Putin and the Russian current administration. I think that's a fair point to make. I think it would be a stretch to say there is Stalinism in other bits of the world, but I think the thing that we can learn from this period in history is the effects of power on people's decision making. So I think we'd established that Stalin was not a very nice man. That sounds like a massive understatement, but what I mean by that is this wasn't a man driven purely by, ends justify the means ideology, and did some bad things, he was also just a not very nice man. He deliberately made people feel threatened. He deliberately hurt people, including his own family, and got enjoyment out of it. So this is an evil man on a very personal level, as well as being evil on an institutional level, leading to the deaths of millions of people. So we got to the point where he had started to turn against his own party to consolidate his own personal grip on power. And yet, as you said, he assassinated, or had Leon Trotsky assassinated in Mexico. 3 assassination attempts, one including a whole load of assassins dressed up as Mexican soldiers attacking the compound where Leon Trotsky was. They fired over 200 rounds and didn't kill Trotsky. So a few months later, an assassin went in under the pretense of being a writer, writing pamphlets against the evils of Stalin, reinforcing the value of Marxism, and wanted Trotsky to review this paper. Whilst Trotsky was sitting at his desk, he pulled an ice pick from under his overcoat and slammed it into Leon Trotsky's head. I think I'd already mentioned the fact that Kirov had also been assassinated, and Kirov was a close friend of Stalin, was well liked amongst the party, and was well liked by the Russian people. And this was the first time that people started to see and understand that Stalin was not just a political animal trying to consolidate power by creating the channels of communication, which is something he'd done as General Secretary, but now was also going to use force, and using the NKVD as his attack dogs, and they are literally represented as dogs in George Orwell's Animal Farm, if you've read that book, to go and do his bidding to create the political space for him to consolidate power.
There's a fascinating, for me, this episode is one of those episodes where, when we've talked about some of our more extreme leaders, it feels like sometimes we're storytelling, and we say, well, this is so unusual and so extreme, there's nothing we can really learn here beyond sort of commentary on, look, the power of oratory, but it feels to me like in any of these stories, there is a point at which the people around him could say, stop, or could say, well, actually, we don't want you, Stalin, we want someone else. And then there's a line, there's a Rubicon, at which point, when you cross that, the temperature changes, and all of a sudden, fear is the driving factor that says, it's no longer whether I support or don't support this person. It's whether I feel safe enough not to support him. And there are many examples of political leaders, both physically where people fear them, or politically where, for example, we did Donald Trump last. There is a sense that some people have said the GOP are cowed because with a stroke of his pen or a comment on social media, someone's career is over in the GOP. So in other words, people are scared to disagree with him. I wondered whether there's an element of this as well in our day to day. There is a point at which culturally we can say that person is toxic. We can say that person isn't a great leader. But then there's that point of, and maybe fear is the wrong word, but perhaps it's rank, or perhaps it's popularity, where all of a sudden we find ourselves unable to make the decision we could have made before. So in this case, you can imagine back in Russia, there's people going, bugger, I can't say I don't like Stalin and he's a crazy man that's going to kill us all because I'm going to get an ice pick in the head. Whereas before, so what do we think of the people who could potentially take over from Lenin? Well, there's Comrade Stalin, there's Trotsky, there's a bunch of others. I wonder whether there really is that idea, which is how do we become better sensitive in our own work and in our own businesses and in our own teams to that point of no return where all of a sudden we're all bought into this person, and even if they're terrible, we have no choice but to fall in line and support them.
Yeah, it's difficult because I think with these things, and of course, let's be really clear, when we're talking about in the workplace or we're talking about Trump in the US administration, this is a fear of losing your job or losing your current position. With Stalin, it's a genuine fear
Life of your life.
of
But
your
but
life
but
and
the,
of torture and violence.
but the
I
principles are the same though. Do you know what I
I think
mean?
they are. I think they are. I think what's interesting is that these things, you talked about a Rubicon and as if there's a definitive point. And I think there is when you look at it with hindsight. But at the time, these things creep up on you. So I think for me, the lesson potentially would be you've got to call this stuff out early. You've got to really start to question this idea of we'll accept a little bit of this behaviour because it's in the interest of whatever we're trying to achieve. And obviously, in this particular case, this was in the interest of promoting this communist ideal and getting to this sunlit upland of socialism where everybody is happy and well fed, and there's going to be some turbulence along the way. I think you then start to excuse bad behaviour.
I think we can all agree an ice pick in the head is a bit of a giveaway that something bad is happening. That I think we can all agree on.
Yes, but I think by then it was too late. By that point, Stalin had already identified, and he'd already taken control of the party. He was already the top dog. Now he was getting rid of Trotsky because Trotsky was already overseas in Mexico. He's not allowed into Russia, into the Soviet Union, but he's still writing pamphlets that criticise Stalin. So this isn't Stalin consolidating power. This is Stalin doing two things: exacting revenge. This is a vengeful man who doesn't like the fact that somebody's saying bad things about him, but also sending a message to would-be detractors who could threaten his power. There was no way Trotsky was coming back. This is the point where the Red Terror, this idea of now the NKVD doing the bidding of the party, and by the party we mean Stalin, is now going around and creating or carrying out actions that are purging potential threats. And that word potential is really important because this is where it turns from people like Trotsky, who were criticizing Stalin, to senior leaders in the party, senior military commanders in the Red Army, and senior factory owners, business leaders, were being removed not because they were doing things to criticize Stalin, but because they had power to potentially do that in the future. So this is where the paranoia really starts to take over.
I'm just live. I did some research. I can tell you the date, and I think this is going to surprise you. August 1940.
That Trotsky was killed.
That Trotsky was killed.
Okay.
He went into exile in 1928, and
Yeah.
so your point about vengeful, this is an incredibly vengeful person when notionally, after all that time in a different country, Trotsky perhaps wasn't as much of a threat as he might
Yeah.
otherwise have been. 1940. Wow, there's a man
Okay.
who
So
holds a grudge.
it was the 1920s that we saw this turn. So by 1940, and obviously we're in the middle of as the Russians would call it, the Great Patriotic War, we would call it the Second World War. And yes, I think, and that reinforces that point. That was a vengeful attack and reinforcing the messaging. In the 1920s, these were purges to remove potential threats. At the same time, Stalin starts to lose the ability to take advice and the ability, like a lot of despotic leaders, dictators, surrounds himself by people who agree with him, but also by the fact that he is carrying out these purges, these attacks. The people that surround him are also fearful of getting on the wrong side of Stalin. So you get this reinforcing effect of people just agreeing with you, and you get this group thing. So Stalin loses the ability to really judge what is in the interest of the country to an extent, and there is a counter case to say that actually he did quite a lot in terms of industrializing the Soviet Union. But one of the things he does, and you'll remember that previously he has started to identify farmers, and particularly landowning farmers. And when I say landowning farmers, you probably get a sense of sort of tweed-wearing landowners drinking slow gin. What I mean here is people that have got a couple of acres and a cow. These are still very, very poor people. But Stalin has decided that land owning, albeit for self-sufficiency, are the problem with why the Soviet Union can't feed itself. And by the mid-1920s, these people are known as kulaks. And these are the new enemy of communism. These are the new bourgeois people that are exploiting the system, and they're not pulling their weight, and they're not providing for the nation. So it's very similar to what Pol Pot did in Cambodia. People are isolated and effectively taken away, never to be seen again. A lot of them are executed. A lot of them are sent to gulags because they own land, or because they speak out against the local Communist Party official, or because they look a bit funny.
You've made me realise that Jeremy Clarkson needs to watch out. That's what you're really saying.
Yeah. Or in a lot of cases, because somebody had to be picked. And I talked yesterday about the fact that a lot of this is done off quotas. It will come to no surprise to our listeners that the whole of the Soviet system was a bureaucracy. And a lot of this was based around literally how big is the area? How many people live in that area do we think? And therefore, what proportion of those are kulaks? And from that, if 2,000 people live in a particular area of the Soviet Union, it is expected that 1% of those are kulaks. Therefore, I need to round up 20 people. And quite often what happened was the local village would get together and draw straws, or they would pick on the isolated family. There are lots and lots of stories of people pointing the finger at the family down the road because they know if they can get there first, they won't get the finger pointed at them. And this is very, very similar to the witch hunt in the medieval times, where, largely driven and exacerbated by the Catholic Church, people went on witch hunts. And they went on witch hunts largely to make sure that they were on the right side and that they weren't pointed at. So what you end up with is this paranoia amongst the people. Not only that, but if the system is starting to try and take landowners who've got a cow or have got a couple of acres of farmland, then what happens is people abandon that farmland and they kill the cow. And that exacerbates the starvation. And so Stalin's program of trying to mechanize the Soviet Union is really, really starting to fail. And he thinks that the answer to this is collectivization. So under the socialist ideology to that point, the idea had been that everybody worked towards the greater good of society, everybody contributed, everybody got a fair share. Now it became people get a share based on the amount of work that they put in. That is judged by local party officials, and everything is done through the party. So everything is centralised. And the extreme of this led to the mass migration of people across the Soviet Union. A lot of Russians and Georgians, but mostly Russians, were moved into Ukraine, because Ukraine, as we currently know, is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Still to this day produces an awful lot of grain and other arable crops because of the vast expanses of land. So a huge amount of people are moved into Ukraine. And we also have to recognise that the Ukrainian people, made up of lots of different ethnic groups, but including the Tartars and the Cossacks and various other groups, have throughout Russian and Ukrainian history resisted the domination of the Russian state. And at this point, the centre of the Russian state is Moscow. It's moved from St. Petersburg. And as a result, the fact that a few people are dying through starvation, massive understatement there. If most of those people are going to be Ukrainian, Stalin sees this as an opportunity. And this is where the real insidious nature of the mass starvations that happen through the Holodomor are really apparent, because firstly, it's man-made. It is created through the decisions of the Politburo and through Stalin himself. A recognition that a lot of the victims are going to be Ukrainian, and that solves a political problem for Stalin. So this mass collectivization is not working. This mass migration creates structural social difficulties that to this day still exist. And it led to the mass starvation throughout the late 20s, early 30s, what is known as the Holodomor, where it is believed about 6 million Ukrainians starved to death, 9 million people across the Soviet Union starved to death as a result of deliberate decisions about the way that the Soviet Union would feed itself.
We could stop there, and that would be a great sort of punctuation on the dangers of hubris, on the dangers of fear means that people stop telling you useful things, and the I'm cleverer than all of you and my power wins all. But of course, perhaps, and this is going to sound a little crass, that was merely a warm-up. So maybe we should accelerate now to 1939. The Europe is in crisis. The Germans have indicated that they want to be the singular power in Europe. They have stated as if they put it in a press release, but they made it very clear that they hated communism and that communism and Jews were the principal causes of all of Germany's ills. In 1939, to everyone's surprise, they invade Poland. Perhaps now is the time to pick up the story about how Russia was ready to strike back against Nazi Germany, and definitely they had not supported Hitler. Perhaps we could go back and start around there.
Well, yeah, there's 2 points to this. One is, you could argue from a very narrow lens that Stalin was quite a good strategist, in that he recognized the need for mass mechanization, not just in terms of the problems of the Soviet Union being able to feed itself, but also in terms of the Soviet Union needing to be able to defend itself. So they built up huge armies, and they also built up the industrial base for being able to arm those armies.
And how did they do that? How did they do that, Gareth? presumably they found someone with a similar mindset that would be willing to exchange technology with them. Who would that be, Gareth?
Well, so before we get to that, we're back to Ukraine again because as we know from the last couple of years of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the east of Ukraine is very, very rich in minerals and ores. And so it is, even to this day, an industrial base. And the Donbass is an area of eastern Ukraine that was heavily industrialized in the 1930s. Even at the point where people are starving to death, there is massive, massive industrialization projects on a scale that I don't think the world has ever seen before, turning whole areas of a single country into vast mines, forges, and production plants. And so before we get to the build-up of the Second World War, there is already this modernization program at the expense of living standards of people and driven largely by what is in effect slave labor. But it could be argued, and perhaps should be argued to an extent, that Stalin strategically was preparing the Soviet Union for this great conflict. However, what Stalin failed to do was to recognize the duplicity of Hitler and the Nazi system. So whilst openly the Nazis are denigrating the idea of Judaism, they're denigrating the idea of socialism, communism, they are also telling Stalin that they're not interested in a war with the Soviet Union, and actually there is mutual benefit to be had. And by all accounts, Stalin, arguably inexplicably, trusts Hitler. And I wonder if this says something about strongmen trusting each other, but not based on their ideologies, but based on a mirroring of, well, you think the same way I do. You consolidate power the same way I do. The fact that you lie to get where you want to get to, the fact that you use violence and force, I don't know, there's a strange psychology there, I think.
I think you are exactly right, and I think we arguably see this today with Putin. And I absolutely agree with you. And so just sort of build that out. Where I was driving at was before the Second World War started, there was a direct agreement between the Nazis and the Russians in exchange for the minerals that you talked about, the raw materials that the Germans needed to build their military. The Russians allowed the Germans to secretly test, develop, and practice their tactics. And so German armored warfare was practiced in Russia in secret because they weren't allowed to do that. And this was an exchange where the Russians would receive military technology in exchange for these things. And to your point, literally until the day German tanks crossed into Poland, there were trains of iron ore and other materials that were going to Germany. And I've heard many experts say Stalin absolutely made sure he kept his end of the bargain up, even when he was being told they're about to invade. And so your point about trust is a really interesting one. That doesn't sound like fear. That sounds like I've made an agreement. I'm a strong man. And as a strong man, I'm not going to renege on my agreement with another strong man when the other strong man's going, I'm about to screw you over. But I think we're getting to a point here where you're pulling out something really important, which is hubris. And we've used this term a little bit before, and we've even muttered about maybe doing an episode on hubris. But I think this is the point, which is it is almost inevitable when you create this environment where it is in your interest to destroy any opposition and cause fear in your ranks. When you look around and say, how do I judge my performance? Not in an HR, I want to judge my performance and see if I've been a good employee, but like, am I crazy or not? all of a sudden, why would you believe that anyone is going to tell you the truth or be accurate in what they tell you? You have literally created an environment where if I tell you you are wrong, if I even hint you are wrong, either you will kill me or send me to a gulag, or one of my opponents will. So both for Hitler and for Stalin, this is a massive protection that they have removed themselves. And so I would imagine there were, in fact, not I would imagine, and we're sort of inching towards the invasion of Russia by the Germans. Stalin was told on multiple occasions the Germans are about to invade. There was Richard Sorge, who was a spy in Japan, who provided information. There was information we had from the beginnings of the Ultra Decrypt. So this is Bletchley Park. And of course, there were Russian agents there. So he was being told by many people. I believe they even captured the plans for the invasion. And Stalin refused to believe them because hubris said, I cannot be wrong. In fact, perhaps at that point, there was a sense of understanding if he was wrong, it was such a staggering miscalculation that there was no comeback from that.
Which when you consider one of the traits that people remember and know about Stalin was paranoia and lack of trust, to the point where Stalin, towards the end of his life, is quoted as saying, "I trust absolutely nobody, including myself." And yet, at this point in history, is absolutely flabbergasted. He is blown away by the fact that Hitler reneges on their understanding and their deal. And I think he never forgot that. The other thing that we haven't mentioned is I talked yesterday about Stalin being arrested a couple of times and going to a gulag. We didn't talk about the fact that he was arrested a third time and sent to a gulag or a prison camp over in the east of Russia, and was only released from that prison camp because of the First World War, where he was mobilized to go and fight with the Russian army against the Germans. But because he'd got that injury from when he was a child to his left arm, he was deemed medically unfit to fight. And during that time, there was an order issued to release all political prisoners. And so he was granted his freedom. But he was sent to that prison camp for that third arrest because he was invited to a meeting and was set up by somebody that he trusted as a close friend, was actually working for the Russian secret police. And from then on, he vowed to not trust anybody ever. And yet, as we've said, him and Hitler, who ideologically are poles apart, for whatever reason, he decides that this must be something to be upheld. And as you said, he goes out of his way to make sure that the Russians uphold all of the conditions of the agreement. Should we take a break there? And when we come back, we can look at how the Russians then get involved in the Great Patriotic War in their fight against Nazi tyranny.
Yeah, we've got to find something that we can kind of say, well done, Joseph, because we've not really found an awful, well, apart from if you want to applaud ruthless destruction of all enemies, well done, Joseph. I don't think that's part of our podcast brand, as it were. There's got to be something. So yeah, let's come back straight after the break. Let's position ourselves on the border and let's have a quick chat about the Great Patriotic War. See you in a second. Welcome back. Well, I think just before we left you, German troops are on the border of Poland. We should probably also, you'll be unsurprised to know that the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, there's some stuff that the Russians do, but that perhaps we might not be proud of. So this is part of the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov and Ribbentrop being the foreign ministers of the respective countries. And the agreement that Adolf Hitler came to was, if we invade Poland, we get half of it and you get half of it. And I believe it was also the Baltic states as well they got. So how about that as an interesting agreement for Joseph Stalin to make? I am going to let you invade a sovereign country as long as I get half of it. So
Yeah.
hooray, the Germans get half of Poland and the Nazis and the Russians get half of Poland. And I think at this point, Stalin goes, well, we're all good now. The expedition to the east is over. I'm going to let Adolf Hitler fight the West, those crazy Brits and the French, and they're going to burn themselves out, and they are going to weaken the European powers to the point where I will become the dominant force. It's all good. Something like
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, because I think Stalin effectively convinced himself of the value of that pact based on the fact that he saw Nazi Germany as a ideological enemy. He also saw the capitalist West as an ideological enemy, and both of these forces. And if you think about where we are in the world in the late 1930s, there are effectively three ideologies competing for a world view, a world system, and that is the democratic capitalist system, the fascist national socialist system, and the Stalinist communist system. And I think Stalin convinces himself that he will allow the Nazis and the capitalists to fight, weaken themselves, and eventually communism will win through. And I wonder if part of that is because his ideological education, his process of going through the learning about Marxism and communism and then fighting for that within Russia and within the Soviet Union, is based around reading about the ills of capitalism, and therefore he saw capitalist West as potentially a greater threat or a greater evil than National Socialism and fascism. I don't know, but certainly it came as a huge shock. The Germans invade the Soviet Union, famously using their blitzkrieg, largely driven by the fact that they need those natural resources. They need that industrial base, they need the oil, they need the iron ore, and they need the food that is produced in Ukraine.
So this is June 1941. So
Yeah.
France has been beaten. The Great Britain there are many people who think that it will be defeated. The Germans are at their strongest and seemingly undefeatable. And of course, the United States is not yet in the war, although starting to offer more support quietly, let's say, to the United Kingdom, Great Britain. So it's a really interesting geopolitical time where Joseph Stalin could think that his strategy, and by the way, as strategies go, if it works, it's quite a brilliant strategy to let the other people tire themselves out. But as you say, Adolf Hitler has now decided, it turns out I really wanted to destroy communism all along. I want room in the East to grow, and I want these resources. And so 22nd of June 1941, I believe the largest attack ever in the history in terms of number of people drive east. 3.5 million men were part of the invasion of Russia. Anyway, let's get back to Joseph Stalin. So good news, the Germans have invaded. As we've said, Stalin was refusing to believe they were going to do it, but surely, Gareth, troops cross into Russia. His generals say, sir, the Germans are invading. At this point, our great war leader, as he is lionized today by many, presumably did a Zelensky. He took off his suit, he put on his tracksuit bottoms, he said, I need ammunition, not a ride, and he took charge. Is that right, Gareth?
You'd have thought so, wouldn't you? This man who presents himself
What's his
as
name
being
mean? Man of Steel.
man of steel, he goes into absentia. He's not seen or heard from for 3 days, and nobody can get in touch with him. Nobody can get close to him, and he effectively drinks himself into a stupor for about 3 days. And it is because of the system that he's created, this centralized system where there is absolute paranoia, where there is decision paralysis because people don't want to make decisions. Because if they make decisions, Stalin's going to come back at some point and then he's going to see you as a threat. So by him going missing for 3 days, effectively the Red Army just doesn't do anything. And historians have assessed that if that had carried on for another 48 hours, the Red Army would have collapsed, and the entirety of the Second World War would have been a very, very different prospect.
And isn't it fascinating that for 3 days, at the most important point, he disappeared? You would imagine in most countries someone would step in and take leadership on, and notionally there would be a coup, and you would say, you stay there, I've got this, not a sausage. And that's really interesting because it demonstrates how good a job Stalin did in terms of suppressing any competition. People were too scared to say, actually, Stalin's not up to it, I'm taking over. There was no one there to take over.
I think there is a wider lesson here. So if we bring our podcast back to trying to understand teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, if you are the dominant decision maker, if you are so powerful that other people don't feel enfranchised, don't feel capable, and fear, then when you are missing, when you are not available, decisions don't get made. And somebody once said to me, the mark of a leader, the measure of how successful you've been, is not how well the organisation runs under your control, but how well the organisation continues to run after you've left. And I think there's a really important lesson in that if you become so powerful that other people can't step up, can't learn, can't develop, then you've created an incredibly fragile system. And that's exactly what we saw with the Red Army in the invasion or in that period when the Germans invaded. There's another important point that I want to pick up on here, which is this invasion happens through Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, and then into the east of Russia itself. Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine are, even to this day, seen as the buffer states, the satellite nations from which Russia feels it needs to have dominance and control to protect itself. The trauma and the violence that took place throughout those three countries was on a scale that is unimaginable. And I talked in the last episode about the complex relationship that these countries have. I was specifically talking about Ukraine, but it applies just as much to Poland and Belarus. The complex relationship they have with reconciling the evil of the tyranny of the fascist Nazis and the evil of the Soviets and the Soviet Union. And the fact that there are groups within these countries that are fiercely nationalist and want to be independent. There are demographic groups that feel that they are being repressed by all sides, including in all three countries quite large Jewish populations who don't fare well from any of this. It's left, even to this day, really complex relationships. And I think what's perhaps quite interesting is the way that each of those three nations has dealt with it differently, and therefore the geopolitical position they find themselves in, where Poland, for lots of reasons, but very quickly aligned itself with the West at the end of the Cold War. Ukraine suffered deeply from institutional corruption and criminality, but has tried very, very hard and continues to try very, very hard to move away from that gravitational pull of Russia. And Belarus, that has absolutely capitulated to the power and the dominance of Russia. And you can see the effects of those three decisions and those three trends in the economies of those three countries, where the Baltic nations and Poland have gone from strength to strength. And I think Poland has in fact overtaken the UK in its GDP per capita and is now a rich world nation standing on its own 2 feet. Ukraine is trying very hard to become that, and the Russians are trying very, very hard to prevent it. And Belarus is probably about as poor as you can get for a European country.
I know we trot this phrase out more than we should, but the standards you accept are the standards you walk by, the standards you accept. This is about an influence of Stalin. Isn't it interesting that Stalin's influence to this day is having an impact on the people of Belarus and had been having an impact, negative, but you can see you are a satellite, you will do what we do, you are subservient. Let's get back to the Second World War, because we've got to trot through the Second World War. Stalin is, I think the technical term, an absolute bastard. Yep. He is uncompromising, as you have said. The death of soldiers, the death of civilians is not hugely important to him. Just an example, which is if you were captured by the Germans, the Russians by definition would shoot you if you were released, because only traitors would surrender to the fascists. So that there were even entire resistance groups behind the lines, partisans, who after the war were punished, because the difference between being partisans and being behind the lines and not fighting, as it were, as part of the army. So terrible. The Germans have now reached the outskirts of Moscow. Stalin has to make a decision.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Early on, I said he went missing for 3 days. He comes back out and he starts to take control. And like all dictators, he is the only decision maker that matters. And he starts to make very, very clear executive military decisions about where to put armies, an army group, and how to fight the battles. He is not a military man. In the First World War, as I said, he is absolved from military service because of his previous injuries. He has no operational experience at all. And some of the decisions that he makes, most of the decisions that he makes, are the wrong decisions. And he gets a lot of people killed. And there is a real problem within the Red Army leadership in that they can't tell him that he's making the wrong decisions. So Red Army generals are going along with the decisions that he's making and then having to then retrospectively go back and say, we've lost entire army groups, or we've got this entire army group surrounded. And this causes real problems. Initially, Stalin's reaction is to remove those generals. They get shot, they get sent to gulags. Stalin goes through a process of effectively learning that he is not a military man. And I don't know exactly why, but if you compare it to other dictatorial leaders in history, Stalin actually learns from his mistakes, and takes a step back. And there's a moment about 18 months into the Soviet-German campaign where he effectively hands responsibility for the war fighting to the army, and General Zhukov and others take control. Of course, there is still a very, very centralized command structure. So effectively, Stalin says, you're the generals, you go and fight the war, but if you don't win, guess where you're going? And it's out to the gulag. But he takes a step back. If you compare that to Hitler, Hitler did the opposite. Now, Hitler did have some military experience as a junior NCO in the First World War, arguably had proven physical courage and valour. He'd won the Iron Cross, but as a very junior NCO. And he starts to make operational and strategic decisions. And as the war goes on, he becomes more and more dictatorial, more and more centralised, to the point where, and I only learnt this by doing the research for this episode, there was a standing agreement throughout the Allies that there was to be no assassination attempts on Hitler, because he was actually worse for the Germans alive than if he'd been removed. So the Allies didn't want to get rid of him because he was
Isn't that
that
fascinating?
bad
Isn't
as a
that
military decision maker.
So we've finally found something that we think is good about his leadership beyond the being a bastard and killing everyone, which we're not saying is good, but was effective, which is actually he had the common sense to understand he needed to delegate and empower, if you can say such a thing, his team. The example I gave about Moscow was frankly a sign of his courage. So when the Germans were within, I think it was 20 kilometers of Moscow, it was recommended that they leave the city and they move to the Urals. They take the government, they retreat, and the Germans were going to take Moscow. And at that point, Stalin said, no, we will fight in Moscow. And it was sort of his Zelensky moment of bullets, not a ride. There is courage. And I think we're very good at painting this picture, almost this pantomime baddie. There was clearly courage by this time in the war. There was courage. He could have said, I mean, obviously I'm going to the Urals because I can't be lost. No, he said, I am staying. We are staying. And I seem to remember the May Day parade. I think it was the May Day parade. I could be wrong here with my time of the year, but troops from the Far East, his Siberian troops, marched past him to give him the salute and marched directly to the front. So this was literally the tanks driving past him were going to then attack the Germans. So there was some real bravery here. And at that point, that was the sort of the zenith of the German attack, and things start to change. And again, partly because of his generals, partly because of the Germans overextending, partly because of now North Africa, partly because other parts of the world were fighting. The Americans are now in the war. The Americans are now providing lend-lease material. And so the war starts to turn around. And just to throw in one of my stories, which I think is fascinating and goes back to your point, which is really surprising. What the two major generals in the Russian army in the Second World War that we know of are Zhukovsky, who actually led the final attack on Berlin, and Rokossovsky. And Rokossovsky, I can't tell whether Zhukov, not Zhukovsky, Zhukov, Rokossovsky had been sent to the gulags, and I believe he had been beaten to the point where he had no teeth left. So the general, one of the top generals in the Russian army, had been dragged out of the gulag and frankly had reason to despise Stalin because Stalin had put him there. Rokossovsky is put in charge of one of the army groups, I think it was. And Stalin says to Rokossovsky, in this attack, I think we should put all of our forces and attack in this single place. And Rokossovsky says, Comrade Stalin, I respect your decisions, but I believe we should attack in 2 points. At which point Stalin says to him, Comrade Rokossovsky, I think you should go away and think about what I've just said. which I would imagine at the time everyone thought was, you're lucky I'm not shooting you on the spot. I'm going to give you a chance to come back and tell me you agree with me. Rokossovsky came back, and Stalin said, I would imagine with a smile on his face, so, Comrade Rokossovsky, have you reflected upon my thoughts? Is it one place you wish to attack, which is my view, or two places? And Rokossovsky says, two places, Comrade Stalin. And he says to him once more, go away and think about it, comrade. Comes back, asks him a third time, and Rokossovsky says, two places, Comrade Stalin. At which point Stalin says, thank you, Comrade Rokossovsky. Please proceed with this attack. Now, it's an amusing, if you can have amusing stories about this, but this is a man who is clearly saying there is a fair chance I will shoot you in the face if you don't do what I do. And yet he was wise enough to say, General Rokossovsky knows what he's doing. I will allow him to do that, even though in a sense I lose face. I think that's a fascinating story. But perhaps, I mean, we haven't said this, perhaps as a war leader, he develops his leadership skills in a way that he didn't have to before.
I think you're right. I would go back to something you said a few minutes ago about the bravery and courage. I'm not sure I would describe Stalin's decision making as brave or courageous. He was still throwing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives in front of him at a wall of very, very hard fighting German steel. He, I think it's probably fair to say, would sacrifice all of those people 10 times over to protect his own power and his own position. So I'm not sure I would call it courageous, but I think he did learn and he did develop a level of leadership. As you said, he delegated decision making to military commanders. I think he recognized the limits of his own experience in warfighting. However, there is a huge amount of success that the Soviets achieved that needs to be put down to the severity of the Russian winter. And we all know this, of course. And it's a common phrase within the military that one of the principles of war is never march on Moscow, because the Mongols did it, the French did it, the Germans did it, and every time they are beaten back by underestimating the severity of Russian winters. So yes, there was some strategic brilliance within the Red Army. Yes, there was some very, very hard fighting and some tenacity, and the Soviet and wider Russian psyche is about tenacity and just sucking it up, and I think that is a cultural trait. How much of that is down to Stalin's genius, and how much of that is down to Stalin's just dogged arrogance and hubris, I don't know.
I'm reminded of Churchill's "Keep buggering on," though.
Yeah, you're right. And again, we can look at these things through different lenses and pull out different lessons. I think what's interesting is the culmination of the power struggle between the Germans and the Soviets was at Stalingrad. And what's interesting about Stalingrad is, yes, it is strategically important, but it was fought at a level that it didn't need to be, because both the leaders of the opposing forces, Hitler and Stalin, had personally invested in winning the fight. Largely for Hitler because he couldn't admit he was wrong and was doubling down on a mistake. And for Stalin, it's because he's got his bloody name in it. He couldn't lose Stalingrad because that would be a personal show of weakness to the Soviets. And so both men, through huge amounts of power, huge amounts of capability, and hundreds of thousands of lives at a piece of ground that by the end didn't really have a huge amount of strategic significance because it had been so heavily devastated. And I think that's interesting. And I think, again, it shows the level of influence and hubris in something that has, resulted in catastrophic loss of life.
And I think it's fair to say throughout all of this, even though he empowered his army, there was still fear. If you do not fight, if you turn around and retreat, we will have you killed. So he was ruthless. And I think, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but the number of people who were executed in the Russian army because they weren't fighting hard enough is outrageous. Let's fast forward. We're now on the banks of the Oder, and so the Russians they can see the end in sight. The great patriotic war is coming to an end. They can see Hitler. They are very keen to get to Berlin, I suspect, for a number of reasons. But why don't you talk us through that a little bit? Because again, I think that's a fascinating examination of Stalin's worldview on what must be true. Given you talked about Belarus and Ukraine and Poland as buffer zones, talk us through his thinking on Berlin.
I think on both sides, and by both sides I now mean on the West, particularly the United States, and on the Soviet side, there is a recognition as the war is coming to a close that victory is inevitable for the Allies. And therefore the question is, what's next? And both independently, the United States and the Soviets come to the same conclusion, which is there is going to be a conflict between the ideology of communism and an ideology of capitalist democracy. And that will be the next great war. And to prevent that being a hot war, and obviously the term hot war and cold war didn't exist at this point, one side needs to dominate the other. And they are both racing to gather as much technology as they can and to create the opportunity for the reconstitution of military power, and to solidify or consolidate their own gains. What happens is that there is it's quite well known, the race to Berlin, where both sides start to show reckless abandon for operational and even strategic logic in their maneuver, in order to be first in Berlin. Now, there aren't actually that many examples of where that goes wrong, but there are lots of examples of where it could have done. But effectively, the Allies on the West and the Soviets meet in Berlin. The Soviets get there first, slightly.
I think there's an agreement that we let them take Berlin. We stop outside of Berlin to enable the Russians to complete the destruction of Berlin, partly because Stalin said there were implications that you're not going to stop us, and partly because the Americans were saying we don't want to take Berlin because we think we will lose lots of troops and we're going to need them if we're going to fight Japan.
Exactly. And we talked a little bit about that when we looked at the Oppenheimer episode, and we looked at the US has this split viewpoint on strategically what's next. So they have to win the war in the East, which is a shorter term problem, but they also need to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't have hegemony over Europe. And so there's an awful lot of deals being done, there's an awful lot of information being secreted away, there's an awful lot of Germans who are spirited away because they've got specific knowledge or skills or technologies. And then at the end of the war, there is a meeting in Potsdam, and there is Churchill and Attlee, there is Roosevelt, and there is Stalin. And I'm sure there were probably several other key leaders there as well. And in that meeting, Roosevelt is largely, I think I mentioned this before in the previous episode, he's convinced that there is a softer side to Stalin. this concept of Uncle Joe, and he effectively takes Stalin at his word. Churchill, by this point, the United Kingdom recognises that they're not the imperial power they were at the beginning of the war, and therefore has to follow the US line. Churchill does not trust Stalin at all and never did, but is largely focused on trying to retain the remnants of the Dominion Empire. And Stalin promises that they will retreat back. They're going to keep some of the territorial gains, but they do things like they promise that there will be democratic elections in Poland and that they're going to largely cede ground back to re-establish what hasn't existed for 5 years, which is the idea of Central Europe. In reality, of course, Stalin has no intent on meeting any of those obligations and doesn't. And the only nation that is really saved from the tyranny of communism and the Soviet Union post-war is Greece. And Greece is effectively ceded back to the West. The rest of the occupied Eastern European nations fall under what will in time become known as the Iron Curtain. And then we're into the Cold War.
Just before we get to the Cold War, are you familiar with Operation Unthinkable?
No.
We have lived in an uncomplicated world for so many years. So the end of the European theatre of war, countless deaths. Operation Unthinkable was ordered to be prepared by Winston Churchill, and in 1945, because he did not trust Stalin, he ordered the British Army to come up with plans to fight the Russians, and that was Operation Unthinkable. So just let that settle for a while. We have been fighting the Germans. We have bled. The Russians have bled. And just to give you a sense of how much Churchill trusted Stalin, he ordered plans to be drawn up for the occasion that we might need to fight the Russians. That tells you all you need to know about Joseph Stalin and other people's perspectives of him. So there you go.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. We should go look at Operation Unthinkable. I bet that's an interesting plan to go look at, given all of the constraints. But anyway, sorry, we have finished the Second World War. Stalin dies in the 50s. What's the last sort of 8 years of his life post World War II? Cold War.
There is an opportunity for the Soviet Union post-war to reconstitute. It has gone through this dire period of mass starvations, of rapid mechanization, but at the expense of living standards and people's lives. There is an opportunity here to reconstitute and really fulfill the idealistic mandate of socialism, to build this socialist utopia, this nation under which people have equal rights, people are gaining the benefits of their own labour and hard work, and all of the things that Marx talked about, that Trotsky talked about, that Lenin talked about. But of course, that is not the reality. And Stalin is arguably no longer a communist in ideology. He's certainly not a socialist. He is a dictator driven by maintaining the power of the party, maintaining his personal power over the party. And so he doubles down. And the purges that we saw through the 30s, that continued through the Second World War, are increasing in both number and erraticism. We're now starting to see purges of people that are no threat to the party. A lot of this is Stalin's paranoia. A lot of this is also just maintaining the momentum. But we see purges of educated classes. We see purges of doctors. Doctors is perhaps the most famous because it ultimately had a detrimental impact on Stalin at the end of his life. But it is decided by Stalin and by Stalin alone that doctors are a threat to the Soviet Union because medical information, new ways of curing patients, new medical practices are shared between the East and the West. And Stalin sees this as treacherous. This information sharing is weakening the Soviet Union. The other thing is they are importing penicillin from the West. And again, this is seen as treacherous. So Stalin cracks down on doctors. And very similar to the crackdown on the kulaks, the farmers that are sort of landowners, this has a hugely detrimental effect in that doctors go into hiding. They stop treating people. And so the medical system of the Soviet Union calcifies, and it's really, really difficult to find doctors. Another group of people that are persecuted are scientists that aren't in line with Soviet doctrine. And this is where the Soviet Union had always prioritized physics and mechanical scientific technological development over biological and, to a lesser extent, chemical. And what this means is that they are a hugely industrialized nation. They're focused heavily on things like nuclear technology, computers. They never catch up with the West with computers. They do catch up in nuclear technologies, but very, very mechanistic. They fall behind massively in biology, largely because biology and Soviet doctrine are at odds. And that's because there is this belief that you can train people through education to be better communists, to be better contributors to society. And that is at odds with the current understanding of the theory of evolution. And so a very unscientific practice appears within the scientific community, which is if your scientific research is not in line with Soviet doctrine, then you are a traitor and you are either sent to the gulag or executed. So there's a purge of scientists, and that really affects the Soviet Union throughout the rest of the Cold War. Stalin has a stroke, and very similar to the power play when Lenin had a hemorrhage, and there is that power play between Stalin and Trotsky. There is a very, very similar response. But initially, everybody is too scared to even go into the room. So it takes hours before anybody recognizes that something has happened. Then the senior members of the Politburo go in, and they're too scared to move him. And it takes the cleaner, who, if you imagine, is sort of a babushka type woman with a headscarf, to move all these very senior members of the Politburo out the way to say he's dead, and start sort of moving and sweeping from under his body. And they eventually gain the courage to move him onto a bed. He then desperately needs medical attention. He's had a stroke. This is hours later. This situation is getting worse. And they can't find any doctors because they've all been purged. And they eventually round up very second-rate doctors and at gunpoint force them to come and look at Stalin. But nobody wants to make any diagnoses. Nobody wants to medicate because they're all too scared. And eventually Stalin dies. So there is a sort of poetic retribution in this, that Stalin probably would have survived from the stroke if there'd been medical intervention early on, but he created the systems that led to his death.
There's a fantastic documentary called The Death of Stalin. I say documentary, it's actually a comedy, but it's a tragi-comedy. And I believe so this is the Armando Iannucci. There's some fantastic characters. who are the real characters. And you see all of this play out in a comedic and yet tragic way. But actually, weirdly, it's a fantastic follow-up to this episode, because if you want to get a sense of the terror that you've just described, go watch that film. It's absolutely fantastic. And then you see the retribution. Beria is the head of the secret police. What happens to him? The jockeying for power. Zhukov is a member of the army, and he is a fascinating. Please to go see it. So Stalin, and by the way, he is not a pleasant person, and so I too am enjoying the Schadenfreude of the, if you hadn't been such a shithead, maybe you would have lived a little bit longer. You caused your own death in many senses, and lying there helpless with people around you going, well, I'm not touching him. Perhaps not such a terrible end for such a terrible, terrible person. What's his legacy? Here's the thing that strikes me, and I worry because there are echoes of today. I am pretty sure for many, many, many years, if not even now, there are people who hanker for the good old days of Stalin. We have talked about how horrific he was. And if you survived, it was not because Comrade Stalin wanted you to survive. It was because you were lucky not to be one of the people who didn't, whether you were a soldier or a purge. Right now, there will be people who are saying how fantastic Comrade Stalin was. That is terrifying, and I think we see that today. This is the power of some of these dictators, which even though they were demonstrably evil and did terrible things, there's enough people who say, yeah, but the trains ran on time. Oh, wasn't it a great time? So apart from that dreadful legacy of people still saying these dictators, they want to find ways to prove they weren't as bad as that maybe we think they are, perhaps almost to forgive the fact that nobody stopped them. Where do you see his legacy?
Yeah, I think the film The Death of Stalin is really useful as a caricature of the ridiculousness that the Soviet Union ended up at the point where Stalin dies. Even after he dies, the paranoia continues. Even after he dies, there is this almost, he must be watching over us, he's still making decisions, this idea of Stalinism continues well after Stalin's death, and it creates the culture that continued throughout the Soviet Union. And then the NKVD became the KGB. The KGB is now largely morphed into the FSB, but there are elements of it in the GRU and the SDR and various other groups. They still have these ideas of creating deliberate paranoia, of turning people against each other, of purging potential threats before they actually become threats. These are lasting shadows of Stalin. But I think there are two things that are really, really important. One is Stalin created the bureaucracy. Stalin, as the general secretary, created this system of collecting information in order to use it for power advantage that becomes probably at its zenith the Stasi in East Germany, as this the whole society is watching each other and paranoid and paralyzed against the system. There's a great story, and I don't know if it's apocryphal or if it's true, but there is a point just before Stalin's death where there is a concert in Moscow, and at the end of the concert, everybody stands up and claps, and then they sit down, and then somebody running this concert, a party member, stands up and congratulates Joseph Stalin as being the great leader, and everybody stands up and claps again. And in the wings of this theatre, there are party members watching everybody clap, and the audience members know they're being watched, so everybody claps and continues to clap. And then their hands start to hurt, and then their arms start to ache, and they're all nervously looking around, but they don't want to be the first person to stop clapping, because the first person to stop clapping will be seen as unpatriotic. And they keep clapping, and it goes on for 20 minutes. Everybody's standing there clapping. They're sweating. Their arms ache. And eventually a rather elderly gentleman just can't take it anymore, and he stops clapping and sits down. And then everybody stops clapping and sits down. And at the end, that gentleman is taken out and is sent to the gulags. That was the ridiculous situation that Stalin left the country in. He wasn't in the room, but the system is so fearful that it led to people doing those kind of things. The bureaucracy becomes the thing that people care about, not the outcome. So, in theory, when he died, there should have been a period where there was an epiphany and everybody realised that suddenly this dictator had gone and that there was freedom. But strangely, the follow-on apparatchiks of the party continued these behaviours and used Stalin as effectively as a propaganda tool. And as I said in the last episode, to the point where Stalin was then used as a synonym for the greatness of the Soviet Union for decades afterward. Even to this day, there are people still alive who remember the communist regime under Stalin and still talk about it as the glory days, when everybody's bellies were full, when everybody was happy, when the sun always shone, and it was all because of Stalin.
I think that is a great place to finish. I think I need to go and have a drink after this. I also think that in general terms, if you want to know how to become a better leader, a better manager, listen to everything we've talked about and then do the opposite that Stalin did. Because generally, he sounds like a bit of a, if you'll excuse my language, a complete shithead. But valuable as always to understand what people do and how they do them. And again, perhaps it's sort of this hint of everyone thinks they can spot evil, badness, and can control it and can stop it. And I think that's true whether you're in a country, you're a population in a country, or whether you're in a business and you see people in your business. And time again, we see examples where people misjudge that. Turns out you didn't want Stalin in charge. Turns out there would have been other things that you considered worse that wouldn't have been worse. And I think that's true as well. But thank you, Gareth. That was, as always with these influencers, it's always interesting to sort of dive in a little bit more and look below some of the headlines that I think we've heard in the past. So thank you very much for taking us down that journey. This is the end of our two-parter on influencers. Gareth, I think we have to guarantee to the audience that the next one we'll do in just one episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. And if you are a subscriber and you enjoyed it, please tell some friends and say you should download that and have a listen to it. And as we've said, we've got lots of other episodes around influencers, everyone from Taylor Swift through to Winston Churchill. Lots of other episodes as well outside of the influencers. You hear us say frequently, we've talked about this. There are lots of episodes around different aspects of leadership, toxic leadership, strategy, command, and 100 of these other topics. So please do go and have a listen. Email us on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you want to send in comments or ideas, we would love to have them. We are also on Battling with Biz in both Twitter or on Twitter and also B-Sky. So please let us know. Please follow us. We would love to continue to build a group of people. I will most certainly, after this episode, go look at the downloads and see if we have any downloads from Russia. If you are a Russian listener, please let us know whether we got it completely wrong and that is a Western story, or whether we got it right. But I think at that point, Gareth, we've squeezed everything we can out of this episode. Should we say goodbye to the listeners?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.